Hello, my dears, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, and welcome back to the last of the Narnia retrospectives. Almost certainly not the last video we'll be doing on Narnia. No, there probably will be a sort of concluding video on the entire series at some point, but this is the last book, and it's I had to go back and reread this one because it's the one that I've avoided for the longest time. It's the one that I've refused to read since I was like 13, to be honest. And a lot of people have this experience of this book. The Last Battle. Now, The Last Battle is the book in which Lewis kind of abandons all pretenses. It's the one where the masks and the metaphors just fall away, and the agenda just comes surging to the fore. It's so paper thin. The story, the plot, the imagery is so paper thin. It is basically a tract. It's a tract for Lewis's cultural, socio-political, and religious agendas, and that is it. Even the characters, the metaphors that are drawn are all bound so tightly to the agenda. It's difficult to see where they end and the agenda itself begins, you know? There's too much of the author in it. No, it's an odd thing to say, but there is too much of the author in this text, and what it reveals about the author, about his state of mind at this point, is not flattering, I've got to say. Plot-wise, it's really fucking weird. I mean, it's really fucking weird. It is in the last days of Narnia, as the book tells you right at the beginning, from the first sentence, during the last days of Narnia. There's an ape, a monkey named Shift, funnily enough, and a donkey called Puzzle, who is his neighbour. And Shift is very clever, as the book insists on telling us. In Shift, there is a kind of assault upon academia and on intelligence and on philosophy. There's also kind of a hit at Darwin's theory of evolution going on there as well. Shift and Puzzle. Shift's a very horrible character. He's manipulative. He's basically an abusive husband. That's his dynamic. He's an abusive husband. He's a narcissist, basically. He is a total narcissist. And for reasons that are quite bizarre and very convenient for the writer, Shift and Puzzle come across an old lion skin that just happens to sweep down the river from sort of the uplands. And of course, Shift sees the lion skin and the wheels start turning, and he has this idea of dressing Puzzle up like the lion, like Aslan, and then using Aslan to cow the people of Narnia into doing what he wants, which of course is entirely self-serving, and so on and so forth. He ends up forging alliances with Calormene, the nation from The Horse and His Boy. Basically, Calormene is the Middle East, basically. And as we know from The Horse and His Boy, which is phenomenally racist, everyone from Calormene is just evil and disgusting and amoral and barbaric. This book, if you thought The Horse and His Boy was racist, Lewis basically does a hold my beer moment with The Last Battle. In The Last Battle, there are statements like, there's a point where some of the Narnian characters, who are of course all white and all very English, actually state they have to dress up like the Calormenes, and they use like a lotion. Yeah, there is actual blackface in this book, by the way. They have to use a lotion to make their skin darker, so they look like Calormene people. And I think it's Prince Tyrion, who's sort of like a descendant of Rilian from the Silver Chair, and therefore from Caspian, makes the statement that it will be a long time before we're pure white Narnians again. Yeah, that's this book in a nutshell. The Calormenes are described in various unflattering terms as having bitten, untrustworthy faces and cruel eyes, and they're one of the ones that really did make me go, okay, Lewis, what the fuck ever. He describes them as smelling of garlic and onions. It's yeah. It's a fucking... This is the one. This is the one that really crystallizes how unpleasant these books actually are. And of course, there are no good Calormene people. They're all evil because of their nature. That's just what they are. There is actually only one. There is one good guy, I think. And the reason he's described as good is because he acts like a Narnian. which is exactly what you get in The Horse and His Boy. Of course, Aslan gets very angry and eventually turns up after lots of suffering has been endured, and 1 or 2 deaths for that matter, after there has actually been a battle. Aslan decides to turn up, and because he's had enough, he just rolls up Narnia. He just destroys it, like that. On a whim, because it's not satisfying him anymore. So not only do you get the crystallization of the overt racism and cultural supremacism, you also get the ultimate expression of Aslan's caprice here. And it's like, well, why the fuck did you allow it to happen if you didn't want it to happen? Why the fuck did you make Narnia in the first place? And why the fuck did you allow these elements in it that were just going to displease or dissatisfy you? It's arbitrary. That's the point. The creation myth that you get in The Magician's Nephew, the first book, there's no reason for it. There's no reason for Aslan to do what he does. He just does it. Arbitrarily, capriciously, on a whim, and he destroys Narnia with the same caprice, with the same whimsicalness. And this is an apocalypse. You actually get, in lurid detail, descriptions of how the earth opens up and fire surges and fire rains down from the sky, and the Calormenes and all of the wicked creatures that follow them are all caught up in it. It's loathsome. It's absolutely fucking loathsome. But the book goes much further than that, sadly. Lewis, I don't know whether those of you out there know the details of Lewis's life, but he did lose his children. He lost... I don't know whether it was his children or his child, but he certainly lost a child to a disease at one point. And one thing I do know is that it completely blasted his mind. It completely destroyed him. And so what you get in Lewis's writings after that fact is this bizarre enshrinement of the delusion of childhood innocence, the delusion of it. And that manifests in the most cruel and hideously amoral terms in this book. In this book, Edmund, Lucy, Peter, Gilpole, Eustace, and Polly and Diggory all die. They all die in a train crash. They don't know they've died. They just wake up in Narnia and they're like, oh, that's weird, what's going on here? And then they find out later, they remember that they died in a train crash. But it's portrayed as though it's wonderful, as though they've been spared the awfulness of having to grow up, you know, as though they have been, as though it's a wonderful thing that they died in that train crash before they could grow up and know what it is to be their own entities, to be conscious, to be masters of their own destinies and whatnot. It's appalling. You get one of the children who survives, Susan, and this has been a problem for writers and for fantasists for years. Since Lewis wrote this book, Neil Gaiman wrote a fantastic short story called The Problem of Susan, where he explores this very notion. Susan survives and is discarded because of it. Because she survives, the children just almost forget her. It's like Lucy makes some offhand comment about, oh, how she's more interested in boys and clothes these days. What, you mean she got to grow up? She actually got to grow up, and that's a terrible thing. It is appalling. It's almost like a death cult. It's like a suicide cult. You know, I can certainly see children reading this and forming suicidal tendencies or thoughts on the basis of it, because they think they might get to somewhere better, because they think that they might be spared the awfulness of the years to come. It's absolutely atrocious. It's the most immoral thing I've ever read in a fantasy book, and I've read some fantasy, you know. The fact that it's enshrined as this wonderful thing, because they then get to go on into Aslan's country, which is basically Eden, it's heaven, you know. It's sickening, actually. It is appalling, and in fact, I thought I'd softened to it. I mean, I remember reading it at 13 and realising what Lewis was trying to do. I remember reading it and hating it, absolutely hating it, and not being able to articulate why, being just angry at it and not understanding why. I understand now, I can articulate it, and I hate it even more. As an adult, I hate it even more. I thought I'd softened towards it, I thought I understood a little bit better, but no. It's actually hideous. It's actually evil. I mean, Aslan is a Lovecraftian entity. But he's not even that, because at least Lovecraftian entities don't pretend to be moral. They don't pretend to be all loving and all benevolent. You know what else? You know what else? I love this. The ape shift at some point to silence the questions that are coming from the Narnians that he's cowing with this apparent Aslan figure. He says that Tash, the god that the Calormenes worship, and Aslan are the same entity. He's basically referencing the historical fact, by the way, that the god of the Bible, the god of the Talmud, the god of Abraham, basically, the god of the Abrahamic traditions and of the Islamic texts and traditions are all the same god, which they are. They are. It's Yahweh. It's the god of ancient Mesopotamia and Sumeria. They are all derived from the same basic entity, which itself is derived from a pagan pantheon. You know, this is an historical fact. It's not some hippie liberal interpretation. It's an historical fact. The Yahweh, the names that are attributed to God in the Bible, in the Talmud, and in the Islamic texts in the Quran, they're all derived from civilizations that existed around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, like Mesopotamia, like Sumeria, and they are all gods from pagan pantheons, yeah? That is fact. It is not a matter of interpretation, it is fact. And what Lewis is doing here is trying to throw shade on that. It's trying to make it seem like it's a manipulation, when in fact the manipulation is all his. The agenda is all his. You also get this Tyrion, the prince, doesn't believe Shift for a minute, right? And he has this thought where he says, oh, how can anyone say that Tash is the same as Aslan? Tash desires blood sacrifice and is cruel and capricious. Not like fucking Aslan, then. Not like fucking Aslan. Aslan has required blood sacrifice throughout the entire series. Not only has he required blood sacrifice, he has allowed people to die in his wars and in his name. He's allowed people to suffer endlessly. He could have just ended it. Not only that, but the God that he derives from, that he's a metaphor for. Had Lewis not read the Old Testament? Had he not read the Talmud? The Yahweh of the Old Testament is a bloodthirsty bastard who demands sacrifices, human sacrifices, who urges his followers to bash the brains of children against rocks. That is almost a verbatim quote. It's amazing. The lies, that's the problem. Lewis is lying to children here. He is deceiving children with a sleight of hand to try and coerce them to unveil them basically into his system of belief. And the book fails in that regard, of course, because I read it as a child and I didn't react that negatively to it as a child because I didn't understand what Lewis was doing. Most children don't, unless they're coerced by their parents or by a teacher or by an authority figure. No child understands what Lewis is trying to do. It's just a story. It's just the way that Narnia ends, yeah? It's only later, when you become sophisticated, that you actually criticize the text and you realize what Lewis was trying to do, and then you become critical. Then you actually react negatively, as many people do, as I did, as many people do. And reading it now, I can see why. It is such a lying, scurrilous, manipulative, cruel, nasty piece of work, this book. And I wouldn't deny my children reading it, not for a minute, because I think it's important for children to read books like this. But I would provide them with the context. I would let them know what Lewis is trying to do and how I found it to be. You know, it's a nasty piece of work, and the fact that it's aimed at children and that such horrendous things are marketed as though they are supremely wonderful is horrific. It's horrific in ways that many horror stories are not, you know? Because at least horror stories generally do not enshrine and promote the hideous things and subjects that happen within them as though they are desirable, as though they are measures of truth. This book does. This book does. The caprice of Aslan is supreme here. The arbitrary manner in which he just does things, in which he just turns up or doesn't turn up. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. You combine that with the racism, the cultural supremacism, the celebration of the deaths of children, and what you have is a nasty, mean, cruel, metaphysically moribund piece of work. I mean, that for me, that's the main thing. I react against the metaphysics more than anything. I think it is the most conservative, nasty little metaphysics imaginable. What should be inspiring, what should be urging children to transgress, as Philip Pullman does in his Dark Materials. And you can see, reading this book, why Pullman wrote his Dark Materials. You can see why it is such an extreme reaction. His Dark Materials and books like it are necessary as a tonic to this shit. They really are. And I'm glad that people who have some nostalgia for these books do so thoroughly question them. I have nostalgia for these books. They were some of the first I ever read. They were gateways to my love of fantasy and to other genres, you know, to metaphysics in literature. They are gateways to that, and in that, they will always be sacred to me. But that does not mean I will not criticise their less than pleasant elements. And boy, howdy, does The Last Battle have some... It's not just negative, it's foul. It is metaphysically, morally, ideologically disgusting, and it deserves to be called out as such.